Drying and curing hemp has several benefits that help with producing quality buds, and depending on your environment, can range from being a simple process to one that's quite complex. Let's go over first what drying and curing does, because while they both happen concurrently, they are not the same thing, with each providing different benefits. Drying rapidly removes the moisture from the buds to preserve them, preventing mold, mildew, and pests from attacking it during long-term storage. Curing, on the other hand, helps the buds retain the cannabinoids and terpenes that give them their aroma and flavor, while breaking down the chlorophyll in the buds to remove some of the grassy taste. And while both drying and curing ultimately removes the moisture from your plants, the idea behind drying is to remove the moisture as quickly as possible to preserve the buds, while curing wants to remove the moisture as slowly as possible to maximize the flavor. This means that the drying and curing process is a constant clash between these two ideas, but luckily there's a standard process to do both optimally. Right after harvest, the buds are still going to contain a ton of moisture, so at this point, drying is the top priority to bring these buds down to a level that allow it to be stored long term without molding. But this doesn't mean you should just start sun drying or baking your buds, because we still do want them to cure while they're drying. So we'll need to drag out the drying process as long as possible while still staying in a safe range. This range is around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take 10 degrees, with a relative humidity of 50%, give or take 10%, or essentially room temperature. This is the reason why drying in the same grow tent that grew your plants is such a great option, because if you've been maintaining the optimal flower environment in this tent, then it's also now the perfect drying environment as well. Not to mention that the smells from the drying plant is going to be just as strong, if not stronger, than the flowers pre-harvest. So if that's going to be an issue, the carbon filter in the grow tent will automatically deal with this issue without having to change anything. When drying an entire plant, you can use the grow light clip to hang it in place. If you're drying individual stems, the grow light clip can also be used to create a long hanging string from one end of the tent to the other. And to ensure that the stems don't collapse into each other, the plant ties can be used to lock them in place. For drying individual buds, you'll need a drying rack, which can easily attach to the grow tent bars. Drying with a drying rack also requires you to move the buds around every day, as if it dries in only one position, that side will eventually compact in, flattening it out and causing that side to dry slower than the rest of the bud. No matter what you use though, it's important to keep the air moving around the tent to prevent mold spores from landing on your buds. A clip fan works great for this, and it's important to have this airflow not blow directly on the buds, but instead around it to prevent it from drying too fast. Depending on your environment, drying can take anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks. The earliest a plant can be jarred is when they have dried to about 65% relative humidity. The unscientific way to test this is with the snap test, and there's 2 ways to do this. One is to test to see if the buds will snap right off the stem when bent, like so. And 2 is to try and bend the stem near the tip to see if it makes a snapping sound. It doesn't have to break in half, but it also shouldn't create a bend like this. If you're drying with a drying rack, you can also just try and bend the end stem of the bud to see if it snaps. Now that the buds are dried enough to be stored long term, you can start jarring them, which will slow down the drying process significantly while still continuing the curing process. The jar should be full but not overfilled, with plenty of air gaps in the jar so there's no moisture trapped anywhere. For the first 2 weeks, you should also burp the jars daily to let out any accumulated moisture by opening the jar lid and letting the air exchange from the jar with the outside air for a few minutes. And this will allow the buds to slowly cure over a long period of time. To be safe, a hygrometer can be placed in the jar to ensure the relative humidity is below 65%. And if you smell anything that resembles ammonia coming out of the jars, that means the buds are not dried enough and will need to be dried longer before they can be placed back in the jar. The ideal relative humidity for storing hemp should be between 58 to 62%, which will naturally happen over time if the buds are properly cured. Or for a simpler option, a humidity pack can be used with the jar buds, and these will automatically remove all of the built-up moisture the curing buds can produce to prevent the need for burping. The two most common options for curing hemp is the 62% and 58% packs, with the 62% being my preferred choice. Although some people do like it slightly drier, at which point the 58% is the lowest I'd recommend. In fact, if you over-dry your buds past 58% and need to rehydrate them so they're not super crumbly, the humidity packs can do this too. However, if the buds are over-dried, they will stop curing.